Rain slashed against the frosted glass of the Shibuya dojo, blurring the neon streetlights into jagged streaks of sickly yellow. Inside, the air tasted of copper, damp tatami, and old sweat. A live steel blade hovered inches from Bruce's throat. He didn't blink. He just chewed his gum. In a breath, centuries of rigid tradition were about to shatter. Valerie Hayes knelt on the wooden floorboards, the stiff indigo cotton of her hakama biting into the calluses on her knees. The dojo was suffocating. Tokyo in August was a wet, heavy blanket, but the heat inside the room felt different. It was the stagnant heat of an archive, of a place completely sealed off from the turning of the modern world. She kept her eyes fixed on a singular knot in the cedar planking ahead of her, breathing in through her nose. The smell of bitter tea and camellia oil, the oil she used to meticulously clean her blades, coated the back of her throat. For 12 years, she had sanded these boards with the soles of her feet. As an American woman adopting a violently patriarchal, xenophobic martial culture, she hadn't just learned the sword. She had surrendered to it. She had erased her own identity, buried her natural impulses, and replaced them with angles, geometry, and perfect, uncompromising repetition. Then, the shoji screen slid open, rattling slightly off its tracks. Tito Wright walked in first, his cheap seersucker suit clinging to his damp shoulders. Tito was a hustler, a fight promoter from Los Angeles who always smelled faintly of stale airplane coffee and unearned confidence. Valerie despised him. But it wasn't Tito who disrupted the air in the room. It was the man trailing closely behind him. Bruce walked into the dojo without an ounce of the reverence Valerie demanded. He didn't pause at the threshold. He didn't lower his gaze. He stepped onto the sacred floor, wearing simple canvas loafers, a lightweight jacket, and a faint, almost irritatingly relaxed smirk. He was smaller than she expected. On film, he seemed to take up the entire frame, radiating a loud, kinetic violence. In person, he was just a man. Lean, tightly wound, but remarkably casual. The contradiction annoyed her immediately. "Valerie?" Tito wheezed, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple with a soiled handkerchief. "I told you we'd drop by. Bruce is doing some location scouting for the new picture. Wanted to see authentic Japanese sword work. I told him you were the purist, the absolute strictest master in the district." Valerie rose. She didn't use her hands. She drove her weight through her toes and stood in one fluid, silent motion. Her joints popped, a dry sound in the quiet room. "This is not a tourist attraction, Tito," she said, her voice flat, scraping against the silence. Bruce wasn't looking at her. He was wandering the perimeter of the room, his fingers lightly brushing the racks of wooden bakken and bamboo shinai. He wasn't touching them with awe. He was touching them the way a mechanic touches a wrench at a flea market, evaluating their utility, dismissing their history. "Good balance on these," Bruce said. His voice was slightly nasal, carrying a sharp metallic edge. He picked up a solid oak practice sword. He didn't assume a stance. He just let it hang loosely from his right hand, his wrist rolling the heavy wood in small, lazy circles. "Please put that down," Valerie said sharply, "unless you intend to use it properly." Bruce stopped the rotation. He looked at her. His eyes were entirely unreadable, dark, flat, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. "What does properly mean?" he asked. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine, irritatingly innocent question. "It means with structure. With intention," Valerie snapped, closing the distance between them. The floorboards didn't creak beneath her feet. "It means honoring the centuries of bloodshed that refined the grip, the posture, the draw. You are holding a weapon of war like a tennis racket." Bruce smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile, but it felt incredibly condescending. "A weapon is a tool," he said, shifting his weight. "You're carrying a lot of ghosts in this room. Ghosts are heavy. They slow you down." Valerie felt a flush of heat rise in her neck. She looked at his feet. His stance was entirely wrong by her metrics. 1 foot slightly forward, his weight resting lightly on the balls of his feet, his shoulders slouched. There was no foundation. In her world, a strong wind would knock him over. In her world, a man who stood like that died in the first 3 seconds of a duel. You talk a lot about speed and fluidity in your interviews, Valerie said, forcing her voice to remain a steady, icy register. You sell the illusion of effortlessness, but the sword does not care about your philosophy. The sword requires mechanics. It requires absolute, unbreakable form. Bruce chuckled, a dry, breathy sound. He tossed the wooden sword back onto the rack. It clattered loudly, the noise making Valerie's teeth grind together. Form is a trap, Bruce said, leaning against the wooden pillar that supported the dojo's roof. He folded his arms. You spend 15 years practicing how to move perfectly in a vacuum. You drill the same cut 10,000 times. But your opponent isn't a vacuum. He's a living, breathing, unpredictable mess. If you stick to the form, you're reacting to what you want him to do, not what he is actually doing. You know nothing about this art, she whispered, the anger now a physical pressure behind her eyes. I know bodies, Bruce replied, his gaze narrowing slightly, the casual demeanor peeling back to reveal something deeply intense, predatory, and awake. I know how a shoulder telegraphs a strike. I know how a locked knee traps your center of gravity. You are so busy being a samurai, Valerie, that you forgot how to be a human being in a fight. Tito took a step back, holding his hands up. Okay, let's keep it friendly, folks. Bruce just wanted to see a demonstration. He will see a demonstration, Valerie interrupted, her eyes never leaving Bruce. But I don't hit the air for tourists. Bruce unfolded his arms. The faint smirk returned, but his eyes remained sharp. Show me then. Valerie walked to the far end of the dojo. The air felt thick, heavy with the incoming storm outside. She didn't reach for the wooden racks. She bypassed the dull training steel. Instead, she knelt before the lacquered stand that held her shinken, a live razor-sharp blade forged from folded steel. Tito let out a nervous noise. Hey, Val, let's not get dramatic. He doesn't have any gear. Shut up, Tito, she said softly. She lifted the sword. The scabbard was cold. The silk wrap around the hilt was worn, molded perfectly to the shape of her palms. When she stood and turned to face Bruce, the atmosphere in the room compressed. A live blade changed the oxygen. It turned a philosophical debate into a brutal immediate reality. Bruce hadn't moved from the center of the floor. He hadn't backed away, but his posture had shifted. The slouch was gone. His hands were loose at his sides, his chin tucked slightly. He wasn't in a recognizable martial arts stance, but Valerie could see the microscopic tension in his calves, the coiled, spring-loaded readiness of his hips. Are you going to draw that? Bruce asked. His voice was quiet now, no more theatricality, just cold arithmetic. I'm going to show you what absolute structure looks like, Valerie said. She stepped forward, 15 feet between them. I'm going to draw, step, and stop the blade exactly 1 inch from your neck. If you move, if you flinch, you will cut yourself. Confidence, Bruce noted, chewing on a piece of gum he had apparently slipped into his mouth when she turned her back. I like it. Come on. Valerie settled into her stance. Yaijutsu, the art of drawing and cutting in a single devastating motion. Her mind emptied, snapping into the familiar comforting groove of the kata. She felt the exact placement of her right thumb on the guard. She felt the slight tension in her left hand holding the scabbard. She calculated the distance. 3 steps. The burst of kinetic energy. The halt. She inhaled. The scent of dust and rain. She exploded forward. Her first step was perfect, silent, explosive, driving off the rear leg. Her left hand pulled the scabbard back as her right hand drew the steel forward, accelerating the blade through friction. The metallic hiss of the sword clearing the wood was sharp and terrifying. It was a flawless draw. Textbook. 15 years of bloody blisters and torn cartilage culminating in a horizontal slash, aimed perfectly at the height of his collarbone. She intended to snap the blade to a rigid halt, proving her absolute control, proving that her tradition was superior to his chaotic modernity. But Bruce wasn't there. He didn't leap backward. He didn't dive out of the way. He did something so subtle, so economically perfect, that her brain couldn't process it in real time. As her foot planted to deliver the strike, Bruce simply stepped slightly offline to an angle of exactly 45 degrees. He slipped inside the arc of her blade. He moved into the danger, not away from it. Valerie's eyes widened. Her momentum was already committed. The sword was slicing empty air, her arms locked into the rigid form she worshipped. In that split second, she felt a profound, terrifying vulnerability. She was a freight train locked on a track, and he had simply stepped off the rails. Bruce's left hand shot out. He didn't grab the sharp steel. He didn't try a theatrical disarm. His palm slapped the flat, unsharpened side of the blade with a sharp clack, parrying the weapon just enough to derail its trajectory. Simultaneously, his right hand snaked forward, his fingers clamping violently around the inside of her right wrist. He didn't squeeze to cause pain. He squeezed to manipulate the bones. Bruce pivoted his hips. It was a microscopic rotation, but it carried the leverage of his entire body weight. He pulled her wrist down and twisted it slightly inward, collapsing her elbow. The structural integrity of Valerie's perfect stance shattered. Physics is a cruel teacher. When the body's center of gravity is violently displaced, the brain bypasses pride and opts for survival. Valerie's knees buckled. She hit the tatami hard. The impact shocked up through her shins, jarring her teeth. The heavy live blade clattered uselessly onto the floorboards, sliding a few inches away. Valerie knelt there, gasping for air. Her wrist throbbed with a deep, dull ache. She looked at the floor, staring at the faint, oily reflection of the neon lights pooling in the polished wood. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She expected him to gloat. She expected a witty remark, a cinematic one-liner to bury her pride completely. Instead, there was just silence, save for the hum of the Tokyo traffic outside. She looked up. Bruce was standing over her. He wasn't smiling. He looked almost bored, but there was a deep clinical intensity in his eyes. He reached down and picked up her sword by the hilt. He weighed it in his hand, looking at the folded steel. "Beautiful piece of metal," Bruce said softly. He reversed his grip and carefully, safely, handed the sword back to her, hilt first. Valerie didn't take it immediately. She looked at his hand, then at his face. The rigid dogma that had defined her entire adult life felt brittle, cracking into dust. He hadn't defeated her with a better style. He had defeated her with reality. He had exposed the lie that a perfect form could overcome an imperfect, chaotic world. "You telegraphed," Bruce said, his tone devoid of mockery. It was just a statement of fact. "Your shoulder tensed a quarter second before you moved, because your brain was thinking about the kata, not about me. You were performing a ritual. I was just having a fight." Valerie slowly reached out and took the hilt. Her fingers trembled. She hated the weakness in her own hands. She hated that he was right. "How?" she croaked, her voice barely a whisper, thick with unshed tears of utter frustration. "How did you know exactly where the arc would end?" Bruce crouched down so he was at eye level with her. He smelled of peppermint gum and clean sweat. "Because you did it exactly the way you were taught," Bruce said. He tapped his temple with one finger. "A predictable opponent is already a defeated opponent. Water can flow, or it can crash, Valerie. Stop trying to be the ice. It's too easy to break." He stood up, adjusting his lightweight jacket. He looked over at Tito, who was pale, clutching his briefcase as if it were a life preserver. "Let's go, Tommy," Bruce said casually, turning his back on the humiliated master without a second thought. "I'm hungry. Let's find some noodles." Valerie stayed on her knees long after the shoji screen slid shut. The dojo was quiet again. The storm outside finally broke, rain hammering against the glass, violently washing away the dust of the day. Rainwater pooled in the shallow depressions of the asphalt, reflecting the flashing red and blue neon of a nearby pachinko parlor. Valerie stood across the narrow street, the collar of her heavy canvas trench coat turned up against the damp wind. Her right wrist throbbed. It wasn't a sharp pain anymore, but rather a deep rhythmic ache radiating outward from the joint with every beat of her heart. She had wrapped it tightly in athletic tape in the dojo bathroom, a crude, desperate fix for a sudden fracture in her ego. Tracking Tito down had been embarrassingly easy. He was loud, flashy, and gravitated toward the expensive hotel bars in Shinjuku, where expats drank overpriced scotch. Bruce, however, was sitting on a wobbly plastic stool under a faded vinyl awning in a narrow back alley, eating a bowl of cheap beef noodles. Valerie crossed the street, her boots splashing softly in the oily puddles. She stopped just outside the circle of sickly yellow light cast by the food stall's lone overhead bulb. Bruce didn't look up. He was hunched over the scratched laminate counter, chopsticks moving with casual, rapid precision. He wore the same lightweight jacket, now speckled with a few dark spots of rain. "You're hovering," Bruce said, slurping a mouthful of broth without breaking his rhythm. "It's bad for digestion. Bad for the posture, too." Stepping under the awning, Valerie felt the immediate suffocating heat of the boiling pots. The air smelled intensely of salty soy sauce, sharp scallions, and simmering pork bones. It was a chaotic, messy, profoundly human smell. It stood in stark opposition to the sterile, reverent camellia oil and dried bamboo scent of her dojo. "I want to know how you broke my center," she said. Her voice sounded thin, almost brittle, barely cutting over the hiss of the rain and the bubbling broth. Bruce finally glanced at her. He set his chopsticks down on the ceramic rim of the bowl and picked up a coarse paper napkin, wiping his mouth slowly. "I didn't break your center, Valerie. You handed it to me. That makes absolutely no sense." "Sit down," Bruce instructed, kicking an empty plastic stool out with the heel of his loafer. Valerie hesitated. Her knees still registered the phantom impact of the hard tatami mat. She sat down stiffly, keeping her back rigidly straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Bruce laughed quietly, a dry, raspy sound, leaning back on his own stool. "Look at you. You're sitting at a dirty noodle stand in a back alley, and your spine is locked like you're waiting for the emperor to walk by. You carry the tension everywhere. It's exhausting just looking at you." "Structure is discipline," she retorted automatically. Bruce picked up his glass of ice water. He swirled it, the cubes clinking against the sides in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. "Discipline is knowing when to hold structure and when to drop it entirely. You ever drive a car with the parking brake securely locked in place, Valerie?" She frowned, refusing to answer the rhetorical trap. "It burns out the engine," Bruce continued, setting the wet glass down on the counter. "You have incredible torque, beautiful, refined mechanics, but your parking brake is rusted shut. You're terrified of making a mistake. You're terrified of looking ugly in a fight." He reached across the small counter. Before she could react, his index finger tapped the tight white wrapping on her right wrist. She flinched, pulling her arm back sharply, a jolt of pain shooting up to her elbow. "Pain is an excellent teacher," Bruce noted, his eyes locking onto hers. The flat, unreadable darkness in his gaze was gone, replaced by a hyper-focused, unnerving intensity that made her skin prickle. "In the dojo, you practice death as an abstract concept. But death isn't a perfectly angled cut. Death is messy. It's someone slipping on wet pavement, catching a rusty blade in the gut, and bleeding out next to a trash can while people walk by. You want to understand what I did today? Stop worshiping the sword and start understanding the street." Valerie looked down at her lap. The pristine white tape was already smudged with soot and grime from the city. For 12 years, she had insulated herself from this grime. She had built a fortress of tradition, reciting Japanese terminology and polishing steel to hide the simple, ugly truth. She was afraid of chaos. She was afraid of the unknown. "Show me," she said. The words tasted like dry ash in her mouth. Bruce stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He picked up his chopsticks again and returned to his noodles, deliberately chewing a piece of beef. "I charge a lot for private lessons, and you don't strike me as someone with the patience to unlearn everything you know. I've spent 12 years doing the exact same cut every single morning at 5 a.m. Do not talk to me about patience." Chuckling, Bruce drained his broth. The sound barely competed with the noise of the Tokyo traffic a block away. "Doing the wrong thing 10,000 times just makes you an absolute expert at being wrong. Finish your sulking. Meet me by the river behind your dojo in exactly 1 hour. Wear sneakers. You can't run in sandals." Concrete felt fundamentally different underfoot than polished cedar. It was unforgiving, heavily textured, and bitterly cold. Valerie stood under the massive steel girders of a highway overpass, the distant mechanical roar of midnight traffic rumbling overhead. The river beside them smelled thickly of rotting algae, stagnant mud, and diesel exhaust. Bruce stood a few yards away, casually stretching his shoulders. He hadn't brought any weapons. He was just wearing a plain white t-shirt and loose trousers, shivering slightly in the damp, unforgiving air. "No swords tonight," Bruce stated, clapping his hands together. The sharp sound echoed aggressively off the concrete pylons. "Tonight, we stripped the machine down to the engine." Valerie shifted her weight. Even in worn canvas sneakers and gray sweatpants, her body naturally sought the deep-bladed stance of a traditional swordswoman. Her hips dropped, her lead foot angled outward. Bruce noticed instantly. He walked over, closing the distance without a hint of telegraphing aggression, and swiftly kicked the inside of her lead ankle. It wasn't a hard kick, but it was perfectly timed to catch her weight shifting. She stumbled sideways, throwing her arms out to catch her balance. "Stop framing," Bruce snapped. "You're building a roof before you even know if there's an earthquake coming. Just stand." She tried to stand neutrally. It felt incredibly vulnerable. Her hands hovered awkwardly near her waist, missing the familiar weight of the scabbard. "Throw a punch at my face," Bruce ordered, standing perfectly still, his arms resting at his sides. Valerie paused, her brow furrowing. "I am a weapon specialist. I don't punch." "Then you are exactly half a fighter. Throw a punch." Anger flared hot in her chest. She pivoted her hips, driving her right fist forward with all the explosive speed she usually reserved for her draw. She wanted to connect. She wanted to wipe the smug, relaxed look off his face. Bruce simply wasn't there. He didn't occupy the space her fist invaded. He had slipped outside her guard, sliding his left foot a few inches laterally while keeping his head completely still until the last possible microsecond. His open hand slapped the back of her triceps, adding just a few ounces of pressure to her forward momentum. Stumbling past him, Valerie barely caught her balance before face-planting onto the rough, jagged concrete. Her palms scraped against the gravel. "Again?" Bruce demanded. He hadn't even broken a sweat. Valerie spun around, throwing a wide left hook this time, her frustration bleeding into her technique. Bruce ducked under it with infuriating ease, tapping her exposed ribs lightly with 2 fingers as he passed beneath her arm. "You're broadcasting your intentions on a loudspeaker," he observed, walking in a slow, deliberate circle around her. "You decide to punch, your brain sends a telegram to your shoulder winds up, your foot plants, and then, finally, the fist arrives. I could read a newspaper in the time it takes you to hit me." Breathing heavily, Valerie wiped a mixture of rain and sweat from her forehead. "How do I stop telegraphing?" "Stop thinking," Bruce replied instantly. He stopped walking and stood directly in front of her. "Your mind is cluttered. Am I doing this right? Is my stance perfect? What would my master say? Throw all of it in that dirty river. When you throw a punch, there is no you. There is only the target. The fist moves before the brain can give it a permission slip." He held up his open palm, chest high. "Hit it." Valerie struck. Bruce caught the punch effortlessly, absorbing the impact into his elbow. Too slow, too stiff. You're pushing the air, not snapping it. Imagine your arm is a heavy, wet towel. The power is at the very tip, and it cracks only at the exact moment of impact. Relax. They stayed under the bridge for 3 exhausting hours. The cold seeped deep into Valerie's bones, her knuckles bruised purple, her muscles screaming from the unaccustomed jarring movements. Bruce didn't let her rest. He constantly broke her structure, constantly frustrated her attempts to fall back into comfortable, rigid patterns. Every time she tried to lock into a classical stance, he swept her feet. Every time she tensed her shoulders, he slapped her arms down. He was systematically dismantling the architecture of her pride, brick by brick. It was humiliating. It was raw. It was exactly what she needed. Toward the end, sheer physical exhaustion began to act as a strange, liberating filter. Her overactive, highly critical brain was simply too tired to analyze the mechanics anymore. When Bruce held up his palm one last time, Valerie didn't think about torque, angles, or history. She just felt an overwhelming wave of pure, unfiltered kinetic instinct. Her fist snapped out. It wasn't a push. It was a sharp, relaxed crack of energy. Bruce's hand snapped back slightly from the impact. A loud, sharp smack echoed loudly under the concrete overpass, startling a flock of pigeons resting on the girders. He dropped his hand and looked at her. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was the first time she had seen him smile without a trace of cynicism or condescension. "There it is," Bruce said softly, nodding his head. "Nothing extra, just the truth." Valerie stood there, chest heaving violently, the raw knuckles of her right hand throbbing in time with her injured wrist. She felt entirely broken down, stripped of the grand illusions of her title, her pristine hakama, and her dojo. But beneath the bruising and the bone-deep exhaustion, she felt an absolute, terrifying lightness. Bruce turned and started walking back toward the bright streetlights of the main road. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't offer a philosophical closing statement. He just walked away, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his jacket, stepping carefully over the puddles. Watching his silhouette fade into the neon glare of Tokyo, Valerie knew she could never go back to the Museum of Dead Movements. The perfect geometry was shattered forever. The chaos had finally been let in. Did this intense martial arts clash keep you on the edge of your seat? The collision of rigid tradition and chaotic reality always sparks the most explosive stories. If you loved watching Valerie's journey from a hardened master to an open-minded student, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow martial arts fans and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, action-packed storytelling. Drop a comment below with your favorite moment today.